Morning and happy Mother's Day. I hope this is a great day and a special day for you moms. And we have a token of our appreciation for you. You'll notice that unfortunately there's no tissue paper to make it fancy. A man put this together, so go figure. But please take one with you today. It's just a little something from the church to say thank you for who you are and all that you do. We love you and we appreciate you very much. Please turn with me to Proverbs chapter 29. I gave Debbie the wrong verse. She has in the bulletin 29:11. That's my fault. That verse says, a fool speaks all of his mind, but a wise man keeps it till afterwards. That must have been me, describing my wife's husband. No, the verse that I wanted to start with today was the first part of verse 18 in that chapter, where there's no vision, the people perish. This morning we're going to look at three mothers in God's Word who had a large vision for their children, and as a result, God especially blessed them and their children. I love the story of the kids who decided that mom shouldn't cook on Mother's Day. So they got out 3 pots, 2 frying pans, a double broiler, 3 mixing bowls, cutting board, 3 measuring spoons, and 8 serving dishes. Mom was delighted. She said it was the best Jell-O she'd ever tasted. Here's something that I thought would be fitting for today. Wanted, lady for long-term position, career diploma not necessary, knowledge of the following helpful: cooking and baking, washing, doctoring cuts, bruises, measles, small broken hearts, and bloody noses, sewing buttons, costumes, and party dresses, ability to referee games and fights, play ball, drive a car, understand long division, blow up balloons, give birthday parties, go camping, fishing, pick up worms, plant a garden and attend PTA, tolerate dirty little boys and giggling little girls, puppies, tracked up floors, and tired husbands. Should be a financial wizard with the ability to manage the household with pennies and dimes and still save for college. Able to patch broken dolls and trucks, be Santa's helper, attend 4-H, make potato salad for the Boy Scouts, coach Little League baseball, listen to rock music, and tell bedtime stories. Must possess twinkle in the eye, shoulder to cry on, easy laughter, arms to cuddle, and able to sing and hum a tune for a lullaby time. Grand opera not necessary. Stamina of a plow horse. Know about electric cords, kindergarten drawings, pillow fights, and wink and blink and a nod. Must be available 24 hours a day, no overtime pay, and no days off. Must absolutely have a heart that will chase after rainbows, kittens, butterflies. Must be able to forgive over and over and over and over and over and love forever. Sounds like a superwoman is needed, but it's a mother, a mom, a ma. And there are millions of them because God knew that they had to be in this world to make it complete. Thank you, moms. That just describes all of you. I think Mother's Day is important, and I think more important now than ever because of the cultural bias and attacks that are mentioned, leveled against motherhood. I've lived long enough and I've seen enough that I won't say I've seen everything, but I'm just kind of cynical enough, sad to say, that not a whole lot surprised me. But I have been shocked at how women and motherhood have just been viciously attacked in these last couple of years. And so I think it's important that we take a moment, at least, to recognize and acknowledge the importance of who you are as people and the role that you fill in our lives. And if there's ever a time we need to look at what can happen when a mother has vision and purpose as she builds her household, it's today. And I think that's why Solomon wrote in Proverbs, where there's no vision, the people perish. Without a God-given vision for our children, our kids grow up in our society and they live without direction. And we see this all around us. Many great men of the past have pointed to the steadying influence of their mother and for their greatness. I want to look at 3 significant men and their mothers, and there are 3 things I want to share that I believe every mother needs to build into their home. First of all, as we build our house, we need a foundation of faith. And this brings to my mind Timothy and his mother Eunice. Eunice was a Jew, but she was a convert to Jesus. Her husband was an unbelieving Greek pagan. Now, Paul was the greatest man of his age, probably one of the greatest men who have ever lived. And because of how God used him and the significance of his life, he could have had any traveling companion he wanted. And he chose Timothy. Now, in Hebrew culture, an older man was revered, but younger men, their opinion just didn't really matter a whole lot. And yet, Paul wanted to invest his life in Timothy. He found something about Timothy that was winsome, and it was because of his great faith. Now, where did Timothy get this faith? The scriptures tell us in 2 Timothy chapter 1 that he got his faith from his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois. And the faith he developed from their lives was so outstanding, it put him head and shoulders above the rest in his day. And the motivation which propelled Eunice to develop such a great faith in her son sprang from her vision of motherhood. She understood the importance and influence of the role in her life. Sometimes because of the way society is. Right now, none of the cultural institutions support the family. There was a day when they did. And then there is so much change that happens through technology and research. They say that knowledge doubles every 8 years. I think the pace is faster now. And there is so much that is thrown at us that we can almost feel overwhelmed. And some feel kind of small in our place in the world. Reminds me of a cartoon that I saw in Preacher's Magazine. There were these 2 cows that were standing out in the field, and they're in the pasture, and there was a fence there, and alongside the fence was a road, and driving down the road was a big milk truck. And on the side it said, homogenized, pasteurized, fortified. And one cow turned to the other and said, makes you feel kind of inadequate, doesn't it? And we can feel that way, but never minimize the importance and the role that you play in your family and what you build into them and the influence that you make. I also think about Moses and his mother Jochebed. And I think this relationship is really fitting for where we find ourselves today. Moses was born during one of the most difficult times in Jewish history. They were slaves. And Pharaoh became fearful because of the way God was blessing these people. And so he issued a decree to kill all of the male infants. It was not a good environment for a newborn child. But not only did God providentially save his life, but he arranged it so his natural mother could raise him until the scripture says, weaned him. We think of weaning as a time where, they go off the bottle onto more regular food. But in the Jewish mind of that day, it extended beyond that to where they could be up to 5 years old. Not only did she physically nurture him, but she stamped herself upon him to the point where even though he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter and he grew up in all that splendor and power and majesty, there came a point in his life where he was willing to turn his back on that and identify with the people of God. He turned his back on the riches and the authority and the splendor and quite possibly even the throne of Egypt itself. He came to a point where he was willing to accept exile and obscurity if that's what it took to follow God. We look in this age and we look at all the things that are happening, and it would be easy for us to feel overwhelmed and give up in despair, but never underestimate the imprint that you are making upon your sons and daughters, and in spite of the culture and environment in which we find ourselves, because of the impact that you are making, God can break through all that clutter and speak clearly to them. And if God can spare Moses from death and raise him from the degradation of slavery, let's not limit what God could do through our children in spite of any adversity and the culture in which we find ourselves. And then I think about Samuel and Hannah in 1 Samuel 1. I have always respected and admired Hannah's prayer life. Her faith and her selfless dedication to God. She was barren. And I guess she kind of bargained with God, but it turned out okay. She vowed. She told God if he would grant her a son, she would literally give him back to God to be raised at the tabernacle and serve God forever. And God answered her prayer of faith. And wouldn't it have been tempting to break her vow? This, as far as we know, this was the only child she ever had. How could she give him up with a joyful heart? She had a vision of faith for her son and his life. Lay a foundation of faith for each of your children. Who knows? Maybe it's your son or daughter or your grandchild that God taps on the shoulder and uses in a very special way. The second thing our homes need is a closet of prayer. Leave your children a spiritual legacy springing from a time and place where you meet with God. If we look again at Hannah and her prayer, she wanted a child to give to God. I think sometimes the reason, I saw this a lot when I was youth pastor. I've seen parents with a lot of disappointment, and I think it's because, how do I say this? Their life was wrapped up in their child. They had a mindset that their children was born to make them happy. Now, being happy in your children and finding happiness and joy in that are not wrong within themselves. But it becomes an issue, it becomes incomplete if it begins and ends with ourselves. The undergirding truth of Christian parents is bringing children into this world. God says, I am looking for godly offspring so that we pour our lives into our kids and lay a foundation upon which the Spirit of God can work through them. And nothing is more meaningful than a mother's prayer. I can't tell you how many times people have told me they had to get right with God because they could not get away from their mother's prayers. Some of you may know John Maxwell or know of him, pastored in Lancaster, and he's written all these books and he does all this thing with leadership and all of that. But he recounted a story. He grew up in a pastor's home, and he and his brother and sister would play church. And one day, Dad was away on visitation, and the kids were in Mom and Dad's bedroom playing church. And John was leading the singing, and his brother Larry was preaching, and their little sister was sitting on the bed. She was the congregation. And it was approaching a certain hour when Mrs. Maxwell would go into the bedroom and close the door and pray. That was her time of regularly meeting with God. And she did not want to break that, but she didn't want to interrupt what the kids were doing. So she thought to herself, I'll just go in quietly and kneel down by the bed, and I'll just pray quietly, and I won't interrupt what the kids are doing. So that's what she does. She goes inside, she quietly kneels by the bed and begins to pray. And Larry says, "One has come. Are there any others?" A legacy of prayer, closet of prayer. And finally, a home for improvement. Believe in your kids to the point where you will stretch them and teach them to expand their hearts and their minds. I think the greatest gift that my mom ever gave me was she cultivated within me a love for reading and good books. And she instilled with me a work ethic. There were certain grades that simply were not acceptable in our home. You know, I could get a C in math because I really struggled with that, and she acknowledged that, but the rest of them better be A's. A B was acceptable, but not what she wanted, and sometimes I would chafe under that, and there were times I kind of resented that, but I'm so glad that she pushed me and never let me settle. And where I am today, and I know I'm not big time, I don't have any delusions about that, but where I am today, where God has brought me, was because of what she instilled, not letting me settle, giving me that love for reading. One of my favorite memories, I was 7 years old. Mrs. Loafman was my first grade teacher. And that summer, she was diagnosed with cancer. And Mom walked me over to her house. She lived about 2 blocks away. She lived right across the street from the school. And we spent the afternoon, and Mrs. Loafman read to me on the couch. I'm getting a little teary. But that love for books, it's unlocked my imagination. If not my body, at least in my mind, it has taken me to worlds that I never would have been. And has put me in a place where God could use me far greater than He would have if never had been that way. Don't be afraid to have high expectations for your children. Have them strive to become all that they can be. I think of Nancy Hanks, who died when her son was 10. She would literally walk for miles to get books so that her son could rise above abject poverty. His name was Abraham Lincoln. A London newspaper listed all the teachers of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He wrote an open letter that was published in that paper and stated that they had overlooked the most important teacher in his life, his mother. He wrote, "Without her, I would have been absolutely nothing." These next two can sound real intimidating, and I don't mean to do that, but the example is just remarkable. I have to mention it. I think of Susanna Wesley. She was married to a preacher. They were very poor, and there was no such thing back then as bankruptcy, and when they ran into debt, if he couldn't pay it, they sent him to debtor's prison. So a lot of times she was left alone to manage the household and manage the church. She gave birth to 19 children. 7 of them died in infancy. The other 12 survived. From 9 to noon and 2 to 5 every day, she would teach her children and pour herself into their lives. She spent an hour each week with each child for individual instruction. Her son Charles became the most prolific hymn writer in the history of the church. Her son John became the founder of what is known today as the United Methodist Church. He has credited his itinerant ministry, going out and preaching in the fields and preaching to the coal miners. It sparked a revival in Great Britain. And it was the time of the French Revolution, which was a bloodbath in France. Historians have credited Wesley's ministry of keeping that revolution at bay from crossing the channel. And instead of having civil war in England, they had revival. Jonathan Edwards was one of the greatest preachers this country has ever had. I mentioned him a while ago. He preached one of the greatest sermons of all time, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, which ignited the Great Awakening in the colonies just prior to the Revolutionary War. His wife, Sarah, devoted her life to her children. Someone did a review of the descendants of Jonathan and Sarah Edwards. And over the last 260 years, this is what they found. 13 became college presidents. 65 became professors. 100 became lawyers and deans of law schools. 30 judges. 66 doctors. 80 holders of public office. 3 were senators, 3 were governors, 3 were mayors of large cities, and numerous ambassadors overseas. 1 became a vice president of the United States. 1 was a comptroller of the U.S. Treasury. 75 military officers and 100 preachers and missionaries. The secular historians who did the research said unquestionably it was because of the influence of Sarah Edwards. At the same time that Jonathan and Sarah Edwards were alive and raising their family and instilling godly principles into their children's lives, there was an atheist by the name of Max Jukes. He was very prominent, and I cannot remember how many descendants they had, but tracing his family lineage, this atheist, all of his descendants were criminals of some kind. Many of them served time in prison. Many of them were on the public dole. None of them made positive contributions to society. Quite a difference in those family lines. Now, you know, God uses some people in unique ways, like the Edwards family. So the idea was not to intimidate, but just simply show the contrast and the importance. You know, we may not have congressional representatives or college presidents come from our midst, but one of the things that I love about God allowing me to stay here is I've been able to see generations in this church. I've had the privilege of doing a number of your weddings, like Darren and Mel. I've been able to dedicate a lot of the babies, baptize the kids, and see them become the wonderful young men and women that they are. And I appreciate you women, the sacrifices that you make, the hard work that you put in, and the courage that you stand, the courage that you have to stand. I look at our kids, what a delight they are. I look at our teenagers and those who have recently graduated, what fine young men and women they are becoming. This legacy of faith, it's a joy. It's a joy for me to see this legacy of faith that cascades downward like a waterfall into these oncoming generations. I'm delighted to know you, and I'm proud of you as your friend, your pastor, for your lives and what you do. While dads are called to provide leadership and direction, you moms set the tone. You create the atmosphere for our home. So as you build your home, build it on, continue to build it on that foundation of faith. Don't leave out that closet of prayer, and make sure that there's a room for improvement. Create a climate, an atmosphere where your children can fulfill the divinely appointed destiny that God has for them. May He bless you, enrich you, and prosper every area of your lives in the fullest way that means. God bless you today. Please don't forget to take your gifts today, moms and grandmas. Let's stand.